And here we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bueno, vamos a empezar en español.
Yes. Quiero decir sí.
El switch.
El switch. Hay que cambiar un poco el lenguaje. Bienvenidos a Pinceladas de Plata, a una nueva entrevista. Yo soy Claudio.
Y yo soy Flor.
Y tenemos el lujo, el placer, el honor de contar con un invitado
de oro.
De oro, sí. Es el señor Graeme Davis, que es uno de los pilares de lo que es el trasfondo de Warhammer en general y del rol, mejor dicho, Warhammer en particular y del rol en general. Lamentablemente hay un inconveniente técnico con su videocámara, así que o es la videocámara o es el audio, así que vamos con el audio y no vamos a poder tener imágenes de él, pero sí un buen audio. Ya saben que pueden dejarnos sus preguntas en el chat.
¿Ya está en español o en inglés?
Sí, como quieran, nosotros vamos a ir traduciendo las preguntas, así que no se preocupen por eso. Y vamos a mantener lo que sí la charla en inglés. Así que vamos a darle el saludo a él, vamos a darle la bienvenida para que salude. Preguntas, siempre destáquenlas, por favor, así quedan más claro. Y saludos a todos los que ya están aquí. No olviden, como siempre decimos, darle like, compartir y suscribirse. Y empezamos a hablar en inglés. In the language from Albion. Hello, Mr. Graeme. How are you?
Hello. Hola, Estalia Illustria.
Well, we're going to start with some of our questions, as we said, to make a difference between the audience questions. Yes, I will let Flor to read the questions because she has a better pronunciation than me.
I don't know. I don't think so. But, well, I'm going to start.
A lot better in English than I am in Spanish. I will say no more than that.
Okay. The first one is, just in case someone watching us don't know who you are, tell us, who is Graeme Davis?
Okay, well, I'm a writer of games, mainly tabletop role-playing games and video games. I've been doing that for more than 30 years now. I'm best known for working on the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and now working on the 4th edition. And I've also contributed to various editions of Dungeons and Dragons, first edition of Vampire the Masquerade, more than 40 video games. And yeah, so that's me.
It's a
really good CD.
Sí, yes. Yeah. I got to take the switch in Spanish and English.
On and off.
So that could happen a while. Well, we got to take another question, Flor.
Yeah. The second one says, which fantasy or sci-fi game was your first game of this kind? Sorry.
That would be the very first edition of Dungeons and Dragons back around 1975. And I was about 17. And yeah, so that was my very first one. I created 2 characters for the game. They were both thieves because they both had a high dexterity. And after playing for about half an hour, they were both killed by a minotaur.
That's bad luck.
Yep.
What start from on a game? What kind of start from the game, I must say?
Yeah, I wasn't too happy, but I was hooked because here was a game. I always had a fascination with mythology and history. And so to play a game where I could encounter these creatures from mythology, that just intrigued me. And I started from there. And then when I was a student, there's a magazine in Britain called White Dwarf, which was the major magazine in Britain for that hobby. And I started sending them articles, little things for Dungeons and Dragons. It was about the only game back then. And after a while, they published one, and they sent me some money, and I bought some beer, and I wrote some more, and it seemed to be a very satisfactory process. And then when I was getting towards finishing college, Games Workshop, who published White Dwarf, asked me if I wanted to come write for them because they wanted to do a game set in the same world as their Warhammer miniature war game that would be Britain's competitor to Dungeons and Dragons. And that was the start of my career.
Wow, what
quite interesting.
Yes, most for the beer, but but I must say, must ask, is that something personal for me? I always was intrigued. Is that the thing that Warhammer has to be a competition for the Dungeons and Dragons? Excuse me. That's get the real tone of this dark grim dark.
Mm-hmm.
It's how do you say influence?
Yeah,
yes, there's an influence in the decision of being Warhammer, a direct competition from Dungeons and Dragons that makes it a grim dark game against the high fantasy games. It's D&D.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons was always a very American game. And by that, I mean that it took a kind of a Hollywood view of fantasy. If you look at old Hollywood movies from 50, 60 years ago, set in the Middle Ages, everything is very clean. Everybody has all their teeth. We were, at the time, we were working on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. This was the early 80s. In Britain, we had Margaret Thatcher. The miners were on strike. There was great unrest. And we also had movies like Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Jabberwocky, which presented a very different view of medieval living. And also, by some strange accident, I studied archaeology at university. So did Rick Priestley, one of the creators of Warhammer. And so did a couple of other people in the studio. And we were, I think, a little offended by the how clean the Middle Ages of Dungeons and Dragons was, and also how simple the moral choices were. And, how there was a really hard division between good and evil, between heroes and villains. And so we poured all of those frustrations into the world we created for Warhammer. And also just a lot of our own humor. You could, if you failed the dice roll, fall over your own shoelaces and this sort of thing. It was the kind of anti-heroic humor that we found irresistible in those post-punk days.
I must say you get a very good lore, a very good yes, lore, and yes, lore from the game. That's one thing I ever loved from Warhammer against others like Dungeons and Dragons. And yes, it's wonderful, I must say.
Yes, that's precisely the thing that made, for me, a better history about role-playing. I don't like so much happiness and something like that, too clean, as you say. And when I started Warhammer, something like 10 years ago,
yes,
I really was shocked, but I love it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm very gratified to hear that. It's always been kind of a surprise because we were an unruly bunch of kids just out of university, and we kind of made the game for ourselves, and we weren't sure that anybody else would like it. So it's always been very pleasing when we find out that people did enjoy it and see things the same way that we did.
Well, it's surely get a good end, I must say. Next question, Flor.
Okay. How do you get started in the geek or freak community?
Well, how I did was, let me see, it all began in about 1965 on my parents' old black and white television. I saw a film called Jason and the Argonauts, which had fantastic monsters by Ray Harryhausen, one of the great masters of that craft. And I remember that Christmas, I confused a Santa Claus in a department store because I asked for a book on Greek mythology. And he wasn't quite sure what to do with that question because he had different kinds of toys and dolls and model kits, but he'd never had a small boy ask for a book on Greek mythology before. And that remained a fascination of mine until well, through high school, I was involved in theater, which is a form of fantasy, I guess. And after high school, I worked in a bank. It was not a job that I enjoyed very much. And in my spare time, I joined a local theater in my hometown. And some of the younger guys there had just left university. And they talked about this game called Dungeons and Dragons, which was 50% war game and 50% improvised theater. And I thought, wait a minute, how is that possible? These people clearly have no idea what they're talking about. I suppose I'd better go and find out for myself. And that's how I came to play that first game with the Minotaur. But then I was hooked, just the adventures, the monsters. I could apply everything I had ever read in mythology and legends and everything to creating adventures for this game. And yeah, I was just hooked from the beginning.
Wow. Let's get the fourth question, and then we take some of the audience.
Okay.
This one is some kind related with the last one.
Okay.
Flor.
Do you see yourself as a geek? If so, what thing or event do you think make you a geek? Where was the point of not return?
I think the point of no return has to be my first game of Dungeons and Dragons. I think prior to that, there was hope for me. Yeah, that has to be it. But as a young boy, particularly growing up in Britain in the 1960s and 70s, there were so many things to be geeky about. I collected stamps. I collected little picture cards that you got in packets of tea on all kinds of subjects. My father worked at Heathrow Airport, so I would spend most of my summer staring at airplanes. And then, as I say, I discovered mythology, and there was something else to know things about and to bore people with. And so the tendency was always there.
Yes, it's seed. There is a seed. There was a seed there. Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's get some audience questions. Bien. Vamos a hacer ahora algunas de las preguntas que estuvieron haciendo por aquí. I'm gonna read them in Spanish first,
Mm-hmm.
then go in English.
Okay.
Okay. David Gualar pregunta, estamos a punto de empezar a jugar el enemigo interior con tercera. ¿Qué nos recomienda? ¿La primera versión o la segunda? Esa te pediría que nos amplíes, David, a qué te referís con la primera o la segunda versión, si la campaña de Enemigo Interior que salió para primera edición y la que salió para segunda, o estás hablando si jugar con la primera edición de las reglas y la segunda edición de las reglas. Respondenos eso y pasamos a esa pregunta, para que no haya confusión. Sondark Trapero dice, pregunta, ¿qué trasfondo aventura que has escrito durante el paso de todos estos años estás más orgulloso, hasta el punto que quieras rescatarlo para cuarta edición, sí o sí? Well, the question from Sondark says, what lore or adventure that you have written during the past of all these years are you more proud of all? To the point that you won, yes or yes, you had to take it back for the fourth edition, yes or yes?
Well, it's really hard to narrow it down to just one. So I'm going to give you two answers. One of the adventures I'm proudest of is Shadows over Bogenhafen for first edition. It's pretty well known, but the story went that Brian Ansell, the owner of Games Workshop, told me to write a Call of Cthulhu adventure for Warhammer, and that's what I did. And everybody seems to like it, and it's coming back to for fourth edition. I'll have a little more to say about that. And then my other favorite, my other child, and I cannot choose between the two, is A Rough Night at the Three Feathers. And I love that one because when I wrote it, I had no idea whether or not it would actually work, whether or not it was possible to have 6, 7, 8 plots running simultaneously without the GM having a nervous breakdown or without the players losing interest. And everybody seems to have liked that. And that too is coming back for fourth edition. I've just handed over the manuscript of a book called Rough Nights and Hard Days, which starts, it's 5 adventures. It's a mini campaign. The first adventure is A Rough Night in the Three Feathers. And then there are 4 other chapters following the player characters, following the story that carries on after the end of the Rough Night at the Three Feathers. 2 of these chapters are completely new, and 2 of them are adapted from adventures that were published previously. But they're all in the same format. They're all a location with multiple plots and complete chaos. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what people think of it as a mini campaign. And then to return to Shadows over Bogenhafen and the Enemy Within campaign, that Cubicle 7 has already announced they've engaged me to produce the Enemy Within Director's Cut. And that is going to be the way things worked out at Games Workshop, particularly in the latter stages of the campaign. We writers were not able to create the campaign as we had intended to or as we wished to. So the director's cut is going to get back to our original intentions. And it is also going to incorporate 30 years worth of feedback from players about what worked and what didn't. And finally, because the campaign is so well known, I'm including various materials and mechanisms to keep everything fresh and new and surprising, even for players who are familiar with it. And also to give the GM certain tools so that if a player decides to use his knowledge that his character would not have to gain an advantage in the adventure, then the GM can punish him in various painful and humiliating ways. And right now I am working on the 4th episode. There are going to be 5 volumes, total 800 pages, 160 pages each book. And just like the late night commercial, and that's not all. The Cubicle 7 and Games Workshop have agreed that they would also like each of the 5 volumes to have a companion volume to go with it. So if the main adventure is the director's cut, then this companion volume is the DVD extra features. And this will include updated versions of some adventures from White Dwarf. It will include expanded background material. I've got in touch with some of the original writers and artists, and they will be giving their memories and commentaries. And it's just going to be an awful lot of fun.
Wow. I must say, wow. Here in the chat, the person who asked, Sondark, says, love Rogue Knight, it's amazing. So, wow, I must say that I'm just right now at this time GMing the Enemy Within for the 5th or 6th time in my life.
Wow.
And it always gets better. Every time I GMing it again, by the fact I get used from some characters and situations, and myself evolution, it gets better. And the party right now, she is one of the players, and the other is here in the chat seeing us. I must say it's a very good characters party that gets full on the story. Committed.
We are really committed with this story.
So we are very happy to hear that. I must say that when we finish the current version,
we are gonna to play all again
with fourth edition.
Yes.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad you've got so much enjoyment out of it over the years. And I will be really interested to see what people think of the new material and of the various resources I've included, so that players like you who are already familiar with it can still have a new novel experience with the 4th edition.
Very well. I must say that I think I talk for everyone that we are just waiting for it. There's just a question about it here that says, any news on when the first volume will come?
I think this has been announced or mentioned on Facebook, at least in English, by Cubicle 7. So I think I'm safe to reveal this, but the plan is for the entire campaign to be published within the year 2019. It's all coming out next year.
Okay, we have no time to finish this. We are just in the middle, so we got to play. That's how to say, that's a warning to all my players. We got to play. Well, there is another question in Spanish. I read it in Spanish like before, and then translate it for you. Dice, pregunta de Pablets de Avendanus, que dice, ¿piensas que The End of Time y su resultado de Age of Sigmar ha sido la mejor opción que tenía Games Workshop? ¿Tú lo habrías planteado de otra manera? I must say, I'm sure you kind of heard some words in English, and it's called a hard question.
Yeah.
So it says, do you think that The End of Time and its results, The Age of Sigmar, was the best choice that Games Workshop had for the game? Would you plan it from another way?
That is very hard for me to answer. Certainly, I think in commercial terms, the end times and the Age of Sigmar is good for Games Workshop. They have produced these amazing miniatures and this grand heroic game for the tabletop, and that is where their main interest lies and where it always has lain, because that is where they make their money. And on the other hand, they have been amazingly generous with Cubicle 7 and the 4th edition to just let us do our thing in the old world and produce a game that's optimized for role players. The end times is simply a way of linking one with the other. And you know, some people will like the fiction, some people won't, but honestly, the old world is the old world and the Age of Sigmar is the Age of Sigmar. And I think that's the best answer I can give to that question. It's not really my place to have opinions about that. I don't know enough in terms of Games Workshop's creative and commercial goals, and I wouldn't presume to speak for them. But, you know, as far as creating an elegant way to transition from one game to the other and to be able to present both as Warhammer, I think the end times work pretty well in that regard. I think they'll be less controversial, for example, than the Storm of Chaos of several years ago.
Well, yes. It was a good question from you, I must say, and there are some points of view that I think the same way. It was perhaps the way to take that commercial decision, and very hard, I must say. There's a question from David now that says, I didn't get very well this question, so sorry if it is some way confused. But in Spanish, it is very confused by the two. So he says, we are about to begin to play The Enemy Within with 3rd edition.
Okay.
Would you recommend the first version or the second one? Or the second one? I don't get very well, but I understand that he's talking about the first edition, Enemy Within, and the second edition of Enemy Within that go for 3rd edition of the rule set.
That's right. Yes. The 3rd edition product that was called The Enemy Within was not based on the classic campaign. It was it used very similar themes of corruption at the heart of the empire, but it was much shorter and more contained. It really depends on what you're looking for, I think. The first edition of The Enemy Within is a very long, extensive, expansive campaign that involves a lot of travel, and you get to see a lot of the empire and do all kinds of crazy things, right up to stopping a civil war. And the 3rd edition version of The Enemy Within is it only has one single villain whom you pursue through 4 chapters, and so it's a lot more self-contained and shorter to play, and you know, it has a very definite beginning and end. So yeah, it really depends. Also, what rules you have and what rules you intend to use, because out of all the previous editions, third edition was most different from all of the others because of its dice pool mechanic and all the cards and everything. So it's the most difficult to convert an adventure to or from. So that would be a consideration. They each have their virtues, and having written for both of them, I kind of have to defend them both. But like I say, it depends what you're looking for.
Well, that's a good question. And I have
And a good answer.
And a good answer. I confused about the question. I must say that's a good answer.
Thank you.
Well, there's another one that comes too, but I will read one more, then we turn to our questions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from Sondark. Again, I read in Spanish first, and says, en español, dice, pregunta de Sondark, que dice, ¿te atreverías a escribir el trasfondo de Estalia detallado en esta nueva edición? Y de Lustria somos muchos seguidores. Now, back in English, Sondark says, would you would you like to write the lore of Estalia, detailing this country for the new edition? The same question for Lustria lore. He adds that there are a lot of fans.
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot from fans across the world. They all want to know, when are you going to cover my home country, and when are you going to make all these insulting little English xenophobic jokes about my culture and people? And yeah, I would love to. In terms specifically regarding Estalia and Lustria, I would need to do an awful lot of research. I'm ashamed to say I know very little about the history of Spain. Beyond all they teach us in English schools is 1588 and the destruction of the Armada. Sorry about that, folks. And yeah, there would be a lot to. So I may not be the best person for that particular job. Somebody else might. But it would be nice to cover more of the world. We intended to in the beginning. We started with the Empire simply because it was in the middle. And so you could get everywhere from there. You could get to the Chaos Wastes and fight Chaos Beasts. You could get to the Dark Lands and fight orcs. You could get, but everything. It seems to have gained this this kind of gravitational pull in the Empire. Everything. It's hard to get out of the Empire now. But I do know that Cubicle 7 has expressed a commitment to exploring the Warhammer world more widely. I don't know any more details than that, so I'm looking forward to finding that out myself.
Very well, very well. I must say that there's a lot of countries, regions of the old world that we love to see it on some. Actually, and particularly book about, I must say, for name it, Nippon, Katai, lots of foreign countries from the old world that everyone ever looked to have some info about it. So we hope that Cubicle 7 has the agenda, the attention and the agenda to cover them, because in the others version editions never get to that point. But everyone understands that there are some points to first cover with the current edition, the Empire, and then some races like dwarf, elves, and that races even didn't get covered from a book, which other editions too. So we hope you can get there with all the uncovered areas from the latest edition. We really hope that.
Yes, I hope so too. But you're right, there is a great deal to cover. Supplements for elves and dwarves would be very good to have. Other materials about the world, more on magic, more on religion, and yeah, so there's a lot. But as I say, the people I've talked to at Cubicle 7 have definitely expressed to me their commitment to covering the world outside the Empire.
Very well, very well. So, next question from ours.
How did you start to write for role-playing games in general and for Warhammer punctually?
Well, I was always one of those kids. Ever since I could read, I had my nose in a book. And ever since I could form the letters, I was writing stories of my own. And I think I was 6 years old when I announced to my parents that I was going to be an author. And I never really, and here I am. So I was always writing something. I wrote, my high school put out a magazine each year, and I wrote satirical articles insulting all the teachers. And then at university, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and there was White Dwarf magazine, and there was another one published in Britain called Imagine. And I started sending little dungeons or little articles on various rules to them. And as I said before, White Dwarf published an article of mine in 1982, I think it was, sent me a check. I bought some beer, and as long as they keep sending me checks, I'll keep drinking beer.
All right.
With Warhammer in particular, I was still at university when that first edition came out, and it called itself the Mass Combat Fantasy Role-Playing Game. And that seemed very strange to me as a concept, so I bought a copy and I looked at it and figured out that it was just a war game, but they had some very amusing jokes in the writing. And so I kind of kept looking at it as new products came out. But it wasn't really until Games Workshop got in touch with me to develop the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game that I started writing for it. I already had read a lot, and I already knew the setting, or the sort of bones of the setting, because there wasn't much there. But I didn't start writing for it really until I was at Games Workshop.
Well, then this question is something I really like to ask.
Okay.
And I will take it.
Okay.
And says, where do you get your inspiration? Or maybe what inspires you?
I get my inspiration, or as we artists like to say, I steal ideas from everywhere. It can be sometimes the dialogue for a character just comes out sounding like Charles Dickens, or I get an idea from a book I've read, Shadows over Bogenhof, and started out with me stealing the basic story of Dr. Faustus, a man who made a deal with the demon. And I thought, well, yeah, that's okay, but who'd be stupid enough to sign a 7-year deal knowing that at the end of that 7 years you were going straight to hell? So then I thought, well, okay, maybe there's a let-out clause. He sacrifices 7 other people and he gets off. But then demons are very, very ancient beings, and very, very cunning and very clever and very ruthless. So the demon has probably anticipated this, and the whole thing kind of built up from there. And, you know, in other cases, well, for example, A Rough Night at the Three Feathers, I was trying to write an adventure set in an inn to showcase a typical Warhammer location. And I wrote down a whole list of ideas, and I was going to just use one of them, an adventure in an inn. But I couldn't decide. I couldn't decide which was the best one. So in the end, I just said, well, to heck with it. I'll do them all. And that's where that came from, because it was too hard to make a decision. And as far as Warhammer goes, I mean, the world is obviously inspired by the history of the real world in a certain period. And so there are things to steal or take inspiration from there, such as Britannia and the chivalric romances of the 13th century and 14th century. And so you just basically, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, take a legend and then subvert it and ask inconvenient questions and twist it around a little bit. And that's where most of the inspiration comes from.
Good fonts, I must say. Good, how do you say? Fonts. Well, good places from. I must say that there were.
The fonts I know, they're the writing.
I must say a good answer, and I keep there because I can't make my mind very clear of what I was going to say. So I get there. And we go to another question.
Okay.
Better. Some question that we really could pronunciation.
You have been working on the role-playing industry for a long time. From all your work, which one is the one you like it most above all, and why?
Oh, well, this is a question we've had before, I guess. I have to say that out of all the games I've worked on, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is my favorite, simply because I have so much fun writing for it. The mixture of horror and comedy, and you know, I can write things and put in jokes that if I were writing for any other game, I'd be a little ashamed to do these things, but with Warhammer, it's okay because it's all fun. And so that really has to be my favorite. I started out writing for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is what I played when I was a student. And there's a lot to like about that, particularly how open the system is and how many ways you can adapt and extend it. And other than that, well, I had a lot of fun writing for the first edition of Vampire the Masquerade because it was so different from fantasy. You were playing the monsters, and I really enjoyed the proposition that it was a storytelling game of personal horror, that it was you had suddenly become a vampire and you had to cope with that. You had to cope with the politics. You had to cope with the existential horror of having to kill people and drink their blood in order to survive yourself. And that was a lot of fun for a little while. But then when it became, in subsequent editions, a little more sort of soap opera, and got away from the horror and more onto the politics, that appealed to me a little less. But yeah, my favorite has to be Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It always was. I just can't leave it alone, and that's why I've ended up writing for it for over 30 years, for every edition, for every publisher. I just can't resist the opportunity to do that.
And we really appreciate that. And by the other way, which one of your work on the role-playing industries you recommend that it's worth to give it a try?
That's an interesting question. Let me think about that. Okay. About 5 or maybe 10 years ago, there was a television series called Supernatural about monster hunters. And Margaret Weiss Productions, I think it was, did a role-playing game based on that. Margaret Weiss, of course, probably best known as the co-author of the Dragonlance setting for Dungeons and Dragons way back when. And I contributed to a collection of adventures called Supernatural Adventures. I won't go into too many details about the adventure I put in that book, but I had a lot of fun writing it. It certainly created some interesting situations, both interesting role-playing situations and interesting tactical combat situations. And I think of all the things that I've written outside of Warhammer, it's one of the things that I'm proudest of as an adventure. Other than that, I would say I've written a lot. I said at the beginning of the interview how I was a big history, mythology geek. And accordingly, I've written books for GURPS, for example, on the Vikings and medieval England and fairy lore worldwide. And I've written a D20 book on Rome for Green Ronin. And I also wrote a Celts campaign supplement for 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. And any of those, I would say, give historical role-playing a try, because it's not like I hated history in school. I really did hate it. Yeah, from the way it was taught, it was so boring. I wasn't allowed to explore on my own. I had to memorize dates and kings and battles. And and when I first played Bushido, the Japanese feudal role-playing game that came out in about 1982 or 3, just the opportunity to go to another land in my imagination and explore another culture and experience all of that was fascinating to me. And, you know, if I've done something similar with my GURPS books for the Vikings or anything like that, I would recommend people give it a try, because you don't need another world to enjoy good quality fantasy. If you take history and mythology and base your historical fantasy on the things that people believed at the time, that witches were real, for example, and that there were monsters in the hills, you can have a very good fantasy experience, and it won't feel like you're learning anything. It won't feel like you're in a classroom.
Well, that's, by the way, that's a good advice about that one didn't need or don't need to go to a fantasy world to have fantasy. That in the real world, there are a lot of fantasy.
That's right. And, you know, that was the wellspring, the origin of fantasy was always mythology, and mythology and folklore are always rooted in a particular time and place and culture. So you don't need to make stuff up.
That's a really, really good advice and an answer, I must say. And now we are going to take back to the public, the audience questions. So we go on Spanish switch and English switch. Tic tac, tic tac.
Okay, click.
Click. Yes, and.
Y no sé dónde te quedas.
Por aquí. Hay una pregunta de Pablets nuevamente que dice: si tuvieras que borrar un personaje de Warhammer Fantasy, ¿cuál elegirías? Mójate sin miedo que al final morirán todos. So, Pablets says, if you had to erase a Warhammer Fantasy character, exterminate it, which one would you choose? And it says that choose freely, no fear, in the end, or have gone
are gonna die.
or have gonna die. Will
Wow.
you choose?
That is a really tough one. That's like Sophie's choice. Let me think. Well, I have to say there's no character in anything I've written for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that I regret. But then it seems disrespectful to the question to just say something like, oh, the guy carrying the spear in this scene of, that's just too easy. So let me think for a moment.
I must say, by the way, that I really hate that one man with the spear.
Okay, so that's 2 votes for him, huh? Yeah. I think probably I would remove the character of Graf Orlok from Death on the Reich. In the River Life of the Empire section, there's an encounter worked out with a vampire on a boat. I named him Graf Orlok in homage to the silent movie Nosferatu. And but the artist drew him as Dracula, as played by Bela Lugosi. So that annoyed me to begin with. But also, I think that the encounter itself needs a little more development in order to really do justice to the fact that this is a vampire and there are all these things vampires can do. And so, not so much that I dislike the character of Graf Orlok in that encounter, the Maria Borga, but more that I don't feel I did a good enough job.
Well, I must say that we played that encounter,
Yeah.
and it results in the characters killing the vampire pretty easy.
Yeah.
The poor one was there resting.
I wasn't.
Resting, and one of the party was a Sigmar priest, so he saw the necks of the victims, coffin, body well dressed, and he deducted all very soon.
And by vampire.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So in our world, he's already dead. Don't worry.
Oh,
Well, this question you have answered it 2 times, I think. So I will read it, but pass by. And it says from Juegos y Dados, Ruben. He says, "How did you start to work in Games Workshop?" But it get answered by a beer. So it's like a dwarf thing: a good beer, good boy, a good dwarf.
that's right. Yes. Actually, here's a little insight into the psychology behind Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and its origins. The dwarves, of course, are miners. They live underground. They like beer. They were based on the people of northern England in the 80s, before Margaret Thatcher closed down all the mines. And the elves, who were slim and elegant and not to be trusted at all, they represent the Southern English, who think they're so much better than everybody else and think that they have the monopoly of art and culture and so on. So there's a little insight into the social divide in England and in Britain during the 1980s.
Wow, I didn't know that. Talking about elf and dwarf and beer. In Tolkien's elves and dwarf, the elf has the most alcoholic resistance than dwarf. How does it work in Warhammer? It's something I always get the answer like because it is always says that dwarf can drink a lot, but there's nothing about elf.
Yeah, I don't know that we. Well, certainly, while we were inspired by Tolkien, and you can't have fantasy that does not owe anything to Tolkien. I don't think that that alcohol resistance would really have fit with the image of elves that grew up within Warhammer. You know, first in the battle game and second in the role playing game. Simply because of this north-south divide that I mentioned, you know, and the Southerners think that the Northerners are uncivilized barbarians, and the Northerners think that the Southerners are soft and weak, and definitely not to be trusted. So it just didn't seem appropriate that, you know, looking back, thinking back 2020 hindsight and all of that, perhaps we could have given the elves alcohol resistance, but only to wine, and the dwarves alcohol resistance, but only to beer.
Sounds interesting. It sounds very interesting.
I'm still a dwarf.
You are still a dwarf. Yeah, I must say you are far beyond dwarvish. She can take a great amount of alcohol of any kind and still on food. I can't, I must say. There is another question from Juegos y Dados. This in English, so I read in English directly, and
Okay.
says, I suppose that you met some of the famous designers in the 90s. Could you explain any funny story of anyone?
Well, how much can I tell without putting my life in danger?
That's the real question.
Well, you may have heard earlier this year, very sadly, Carl Sargent died. He's disappeared from the games industry sometime in the middle 90s, and it was a big mystery what had happened to him, and I still don't know. But he was quite a character. He was a Cambridge academic. He had doctorates in both psychology and parapsychology. And we used to call him the Peter Venkman of gaming, because the character from Ghostbusters had exact identical degrees. But he was quite a character. The thing I remember most about him is his cologne. It was always possible to tell whether he had been in a room during the previous 3 hours.
That's one. That's a real good one.
Yeah. But see if I can think of anything else.
Well, we take a moment to promote the channel. What you think in Spanish? We will talk and you think. So, mientras tanto, mientras aquí
volvemos al switch español.
Claro, mientras piensa la respuesta para dar una respuesta más, les recordamos. No olviden suscribirse al canal, ¿sí? Que llegamos a los 750 y vamos a estar haciendo el directo respondiendo nosotros las preguntas que ustedes nos dejan en el chat.
Las maliciosas, las buenas, sí,
todas. Y darle like al video actual, al actual, y compartirlo para ver si se suma más gente. Vamos a ver de que se sumen más espectadores que quieran escuchar esta entrevista, primera entrevista en inglés y última entrevista del año.
Sí, pero la última del año.
Bueno. Taking back to the English switch, tech. I get up and you get down, but we had to get better connected than that.
Okay.
It's the English, in the English switch we can connect very well on that. In Spanish we connect better.
Yes.
I think.
Sure. Okay, well, while we're doing your promo, I did think of another story. Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell two of the primary designers of Warhammer. They first met in primary school, I think, when they were very young, and they knew each other all their lives, and they would joke with each other. I remember one time when I think the game Dark Future was being developed, which Richard Halliwell had designed, and he was constructing cardboard buildings for a prototype layout. And they got into this routine, like two seasoned television comics will banter with each other. They were just like that. And it went something like, "Oh, you're making buildings. Yes, I'm going to make some buildings too. And mine will be taller than yours. Oh, really? But mine will stay up longer." And it was like this with them every day. I'm surprised we got any work done. We were always laughing.
That's remind me. It has something to do with the joke in the Middenheim book about what Aldorfians says about Middenheimers buildings.
Yes, the best thing about them is that they last forever, and the worst thing about them is that they last forever because the architecture is so ugly.
Yes, it has something about that story you just told, or it come from another way.
Well, I don't think there's a direct connection, but definitely it's a similar indication of the pool of humor that was in existence at the Games Workshop studio in those days.
Well, let's go to another question from Rubén of Juegos y Dados, and says, what kind of articles did you write in White Dwarf?
A great variety. A lot of them in the beginning were for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then as I started playing Call of Cthulhu, I would write for that as well. And let me think, my first article was published in White Dwarf issue 32, July 1982. And that was a little one-page article about drug addiction, giving some example drugs and a mechanism for the sort of physical and mental deterioration that takes place during withdrawal and things like that. And I remember some of my friends at home were quite shocked, and they said, "What were you doing at university if you're writing about drugs and addiction and withdrawal?" And but that was the first thing. And I wrote a number of little adventures, and essentially whenever I encountered a problem in my own campaign where I was playing at university, and I had to write some rules to accommodate a situation that wasn't covered in the rule books, I would develop that into an article and send it into White Dwarf. So I published some advanced rules for languages, because according to the rules back then, a half elf with a minimum intelligence of 3 still automatically spoke 5 or 7 languages. Yeah. And you either spoke language or you didn't. There was no level of competence, no percentage or anything. So I wrote a system for that. And another time I wrote some rules for drowning. And sometimes I'd have an idea for an adventure, and I'd write that and send it in. And as I started playing Call of Cthulhu and White Dwarf started covering that game, the same thing applied. It was essentially whatever came to mind, prompted by my own gaming experiences.
Well, that's a good answer, and I must say I didn't read a lot of that white dwarf, because they had
well, you were probably in utero back then.
How you say? Excuse me.
You were probably not born.
Ah, yes. I think I was born by that time, but mostly I read some of them now. I found some of them translated or shared, and I must say that there were, and they are better, good articles. I just read someone about an NPCs you read it from White Dwarf 7.
Oh, yes, you just about that. I think the Cast of Thousands, I think it was called.
I didn't remember right now. I read it a week or two ago, and
yes.
I really like it, and it's very actually too.
Oh, thank you.
Well, there is another question here from the audience. Well, I'll read that this one and get back to ours. So, Juegos y Dados nuevamente, again, Juegos y Dados says, what do you think of the success of Warhammer Total War? Do you think part of that success is the setting?
I think it is possibly. Certainly, I mean, I actually worked on a couple of Total War titles a few years ago, but not Warhammer, strangely. But it is it's what we call in English a marriage made in heaven. The visuals of the Total War game engine and the races and creatures of Warhammer they just were made to go together, and I'm very, very pleased to see that it's a success. So the setting kind of informs a lot of things about Warhammer. Warhammer wouldn't be Warhammer without the setting. And so that informs the storylines and the locations and so on in the, especially in the single player mode of Warhammer Total War. So yes, it's fair to say it wouldn't be the same without the setting. I think more significantly, it wouldn't be the same without the Warhammer logo. You know, we must distinguish between the setting and the brand. And the Warhammer brand is extremely powerful. And while the setting, yes, is a part of that, it's not the only part. But having said that, I'm very proud of the Warhammer setting and the contributions that I've been able to make to it. And so I like to think it wouldn't be the same. Warhammer Total War would not be the same without the setting. But it could be equally as good. You don't know.
Yes, I kind of think that the Warhammer brand and the setting has a strong connection. I think that's because most of the fans shouted out very, very loud when the end of time gets announced and it comes to an end, and what makes difficult for all the old fans to accept the new Age of Sigmar. I think there is some kind of connection, closed connection, but as you say there's two different scenes. But I must say that
the naming, maybe.
Yes, the setting of Warhammer, the lore of Warhammer, it's so powerful, so rich that it's easily association with the Warhammer brand, because it's the world, except from the part of the old world, but the whole world has a name of its own, of its own. In D&D, you have Mistara, you have the Great and you can separate the world setting from the brand. But in Warhammer, it's not like that. So it seems to me that that's the very difficult of get the knowledge to understand that Warhammer, the brand, is a thing, and Warhammer, the old world and all its setting is another.
Yes, I think in many games, separation between the setting and the brand, which is greater than is the case in Warhammer. But also one must consider things like the art style, the races, you know, some of these, it's all interconnected, but not necessarily a part of the lore and the fiction. But you see a picture by John Blanche, for example, or Paul Bonner or Dave Gallagher, or any of the artists who have a long association with Warhammer, and you immediately are thinking, this is Warhammer. And that's not because of anything I've written or anybody else who is writing lore, you know. So it's part of the greater brand. But you are right. The fact that Warhammer has stuck to, Warhammer Fantasy specifically, has stuck to one world and one setting, gives the two a very strong association. That's not the case with Dungeons and Dragons, you know, Ravenloft, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, Eberron, Spelljammer, any of them. There's not that close association.
Yes, I think it could be. Well, back to our questions. We will back to the audience questions soon, but I let Flor take the questions now.
Me again.
Yes.
Okay. What are you working on for future publications?
Well, as I've already said, I just handed over the 5-part mini campaign, Rough Nights and Hard Days, for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. And I'm currently working on the director's cut of the Enemy Within campaign, which, as I've said, will be 5 parts, and each part will consist of a main volume and a companion volume. And that is the foreseeable future for me. I've been talking with Cubicle 7 about other possibilities for Warhammer, and I'm currently working on a video game for a startup company, which I'm not allowed to tell you anything about. That's right. So, yeah, that is as far as I can see into the future at this point. But if you continue to watch the Cubicle 7 website, or if it's permissible for me to promote my blog on your channel, it's graemedavis.wordpress.com. And I also tweet as @GraemeJDavis. And so that's where the news comes out. When I know it, I'll tell you.
Well, we will add that to reference. You say your blog and your Twitter account to the description of the video when we finish.
Great.
Maybe if we had time here and it's not too late when we finish. If not, tomorrow at the utmost time. But we have in the description so people can get the reference to you and see how it's being developed, how the project, how the Warhammer War project gets developed. I get a bit. There's no word today.
That happens to me in interviews too, and I'm not even working in a second language.
Gollum. Yeah. Well, Flor.
Now that the 4th edition of Warhammer RPG is out, we can see that much of the old spirit come alive too. So, what can we expect to see in the future about the Warhammer lore? How much of the old lore will return and how it will merge with the more recent one?
We say lore, but we are talking about the setting.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah. And this is a question I've been asked most frequently about 4th edition, because each of the previous 3 editions had its own particular weakness. With 1st edition, the setting was one that everyone liked, but the mechanics were not so strong, and there are reasons for that. The 2nd edition, the mechanics were much improved, but Games Workshop decided to set the game 20 years in the future after their Storm of Chaos event. And then the 3rd edition had radically different mechanics, and some people liked that and some people didn't. Now, 4th edition, Cubicle 7 and our intention has been to combine the best of all previous editions. So, for example, we've kept the setting of 1st edition. The mechanics are largely based on 2nd edition, so that they work a lot better. They've been expanded from there as well, been further developed. And so, as far as the Enemy Within Director's Cut goes, that is set in the same year, 2512, and in the same setting. But as everybody knows who knows anything about Warhammer, the lore, the setting is a very changeable thing. A new Warhammer Army book comes out, and you know, something that existed before doesn't exist. And I have given myself the task of reconciling as many of these difficulties as I possibly can. For example, there's a town called Immelschelt in the Empire, and in some books, it's the final L is rendered as an I, so it comes out as Immelscheit. And so I've reconciled that by making a little joke in the book about German sign writing, and you know, that sort of very jagged, spiky sort of script that they used in the 19th century and before. And the Southerners call it Immelscheit because they can't read the Northerners' writing on the signs. And if you know anything about English or German, the syllable "scheit" is also not a very polite one. So the people of the town are very upset when visitors pronounce the name wrong.
That's a clever solution.
And the big thing, the big promise that I'm making in the Enemy Within Director's Cut is that I am going to solve the problem of the nature of Emperor Karl Franz. You know, in 1st edition, he's a poor, sickly man, ineffectual. And in 2nd edition, he is a mighty warrior riding a huge griffin. And the question is always asked, which of these is true? And I promise you that the answer is both. And in the final episode of the Enemy Within Director's Cut, you will find out how that is possible.
Wow.
And I think you will like it. I think I'm very pleased. I spent some time congratulating myself after I came up with the solution, and I hope that everybody else will think that I'm as clever as I think I am in doing that.
I'm really curious about that. I must say that I'm waiting to read that and to know about that. I had a question about something you said about the Warhammer lore. Do you believe that now that the official Games Workshop game has passed off, that gets some way easier to take the setting and write what you really want. I read in the past, most in the end of the first edition, and yes, in the end of the first edition, when Hogshead has the license, that there were some difficulties to write about the Warhammer setting because of that thing you named about the Warhammer fantasy battle, and it make it things a bit difficult. You think that now there is more easy?
I think oh, was that me? Am I having trouble with my microphone?
Yes, we hear you right now very well.
Okay, good. So yes, it is easier because nothing we write now in the old world setting can interfere with any future product planned by Games Workshop. And so that gives us more freedom. It also gives the people at Games Workshop more peace of mind that they don't have to be so vigilant. But don't get me wrong, we are still getting a lot of input from the licensing team at Games Workshop, most of whom grew up as fans of the role-playing game and are really on the same page with us, and they've been a delight to work with. And they have some great ideas, things that we didn't think of first. And but yes, to answer the question, the fact that the old world has been retired by Games Workshop gives us a great deal more freedom, and it makes the approval process smoother and faster than definitely than the process that Hogshead had to deal with.
Very well, very well. Last question from ours, then back to the public. Okay. Tell us if you are all right with the timing. We are far from the hour and a half.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, because I think
I'll talk about Warhammer for as long as anybody cares to listen.
Well, we take some popcorn here and we can talk in days, I must say. One of my passions, I must say, in role playing, in all the things.
He's a really geek about Warhammer.
Yes. If when we finish, if you don't mind, I will show you my little collection of miniatures about Warhammer only.
All right.
Well, another question.
Well, the enemy within Director's Cut is on its way. What will be changed from the original? Will the last chapter about the Skavens, the Horner Rat, finally see the light?
Yes, it will. In fact, that's what I'm working on right now.
Wow, that's very great news.
Tell me about that. Sorry.
That's okay. That was always our original plan, that the fourth volume would be the Horned Rat. And then for various reasons, Ken Ralston was brought on board as a well-known American writer to see if his name on a book would increase sales in the United States. And he created Something Rotten in Kislev. And again, for commercial reasons, it seemed to make sense to put the Enemy Within logo on that book. And it has been controversial ever since. And so for the director's cut, I proposed to Cubicle 7 that we do the Horned Rat instead. I had a conversation with Phil Gallagher. I'm still kind of in touch with him. And we pooled our memories and tried to remember as much as we could about it. And yeah, as I say, it's being written right now.
That's very good news, I must say. Okay, we go to some of the public audience questions. I must say that there is a lot of question in English by now. So where we
very kind to do that.
Yes. So let's yeah. Well, this is in Spanish. I read in Spanish. Back to English. Tic tac. Pablets de Avendanus dice, Graeme, ¿le das al Blood Bowl raza favorita? So, in English, say, Graeme, do you play Blood Bowl? Have you got a favorite race or team?
I've not played for some time. I did take part in the initial play tests at Games Workshop, and it was a lot of fun. I was never any good at it, but it was a lot of fun. And I was building an undead team. Going back to Jason and the Argonauts, those skeletons had an effect on me, my impressionable 6-year-old mind. And I've been obsessed with the undead ever since, and they're my favorite race in every game I play. Even if they're not the strongest race, I just feel this loyalty towards them. So yeah, I started to try and build an undead team, but I never really got it completed. And I haven't played for quite a while, but I hear that Blood Bowl still has a very, very strong following. In fact, my friend Pete Nifton has been to a couple of Blood Bowl events in Italy and had a great time there.
Well, yes, there is still fans from Blood Bowl, and it has a new edition not 2-3 years ago, if I remember well.
That is, yeah.
Well, there is a question in Spanish, says in Spanish, Ramón Rol en Familias dice, ¿qué piensas sobre el uso de los juegos de rol como herramienta educativa? Por ejemplo, la estética del Classcraft, que me recuerda mucho al mundo de Warhammer. So, in English, it's a very interesting question and says, what do you think about the use of role-playing games as an educational tool? For example, the Classcraft aesthetics that reminds me much to the world of Warhammer.
I'm not that particular example, but I've always thought that there's a great potential for role-playing games in education. I remember, again, when I was at university, the fighting fantasy game books were very popular, and I tried to develop a series of similar choose-your-own-adventure type books for my university museum to illustrate several points about the progress of technology in prehistory. They didn't turn out so well, unfortunately. But yes, I've mentioned already my work in historical fantasy, and it can be a very powerful tool for exploring an environment, even for running through a situation. I can imagine, for example, in cases of phobia or post-traumatic stress, the ability to rehearse a situation in a safe environment will then reduce the amount of stress associated with confronting that situation in real life. And, I know role-playing exercises are used in the treatment of mental health issues quite widely, even if they're not role-playing games as we know them.
Pretty well, very well. So, El Poderoso Chrome, the Mighty Chrome in English, it's the name of his person, says, hello, I hate the end of time and the age of Sigmar. Will the role-play work towards that part of the license, or will it remain true to the dark grim style full of irony?
It will carry on with the old world as everybody knows and loves it. The end times, I've not heard anything mentioned by Cubicle 7. I cannot speak on their behalf. I'm not an officer or an employee of that company. But my understanding is that, for example, in my work on The Enemy Within Director's Cut, the intention is definitely to preserve the world and the tone and the atmosphere that everybody remembers from first edition.
Well, the same person, El Poderoso Chrome, he wrote a lot of questions. I really like it. So keep on writing. And he says, a serious question now. In my group, normally we play with an ogre character during the years of the second edition. Will we have the opportunity to role-play with one of these monsters in this edition?
Ogres are as a race in the book, but I do believe that there is the intention to produce some rules for them in a supplement. I cannot make that promise 100%, but I'm fairly confident it will be the case.
Well, and by the way, in that case, I must say that if I did remember well, that there is some rule to personalize the NPCs from the bestiary and convert them some kind of PCs. So I think he could go on that in that case.
Yes, definitely. It will always be possible. Using the established rules and a little imagination and a little work. But as I say, I can't say whether there will be anything official. I think there will be, but I don't remember where I heard that or who told me or how definite it was.
There is a chance. He says another question and says, personally, I find the art of the new edition impressive, but I have read people who lamented the lack of elements of the original dark green to John Howe and very little John Blanche. Do you share that opinion?
Not really. A lot of people have a nostalgic attachment to the simpler black and white art of the first edition. And I like the more finished look of the fourth edition art, personally. I think it forms a nice balance. I do concur that between the second and third editions, there was a shift in the tone and the feel of the art, and it got a lot more slick, a lot more finished, a lot more D&D almost. And I like the grittier approach. I think the fourth edition has gone back down that road a little way, but perhaps not far enough for some people. John Blanche, unfortunately, has had some health problems. He's still drawing, and he's still a great artist, but he's not so closely associated with Games Workshop, and he's not doing so much that could be used for Warhammer. Tony Ackland, another great artist whose name is synonymous with early Warhammer, he is now retired. And so, that generation of artists with their particular look and their way of drawing things, they're no longer available to us as they were. But I think that the artists who are coming up and who are being used in the fourth edition, you can tell looking at a picture whether or not an artist gets it, whether or not an artist instinctively has captured the essence of the Warhammer world. and this is actually a conversation I had a little while ago with Andy Law, who's the project developer for Cubicle 7. And I think the artists whose work you see in the 4th edition rulebook, they definitely get it. Now, it's a matter of personal taste, whether you like the way they finish their drawings, but I think in terms of the content and the tone, it certainly satisfies me.
The same person, Poderoso Chrome, says, personally, I find the art of the new edition very magical and evocative. I think it's a very accurate approach. So we're more asking because of the other people's feelings, I must say. Dan says he really likes it. I do like the new art. I think it's very good. It's very it's a kind of mix between old school and something new.
I agree. That's important. I think if we were to put out a book today with the same kind of illustrations as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay had in 1986, it would look very strange compared to the kind of products that one sees today. So yeah, I think Crom is right there. It's a matter of compromise. It's a matter of blending the spirit of the old with the technique of the new. And I think Cubicle 7 has done a fantastic job so far of achieving that.
Well, he continues now. He says, I especially like to see how it has been reflected that ethnically the old world is now very diverse, with different ethnic groups and character of both sexes. Yes, I really like that actualization, I must say. Yes, I agree with that. So he continues answering. Oh, yes, here. He says, the same person. It's Grom asking now. Says he is asking better. We will have setting or campaign industria. Something you already answered, but if you want to answer it again.
All I can say for certain, based on what I know, is that Cubicle 7 is committed to exploring areas beyond the Empire and beyond the old world. Further than that, I cannot say. I don't have access to the specifics, and even if I did, it would not be appropriate for me to make predictions on behalf of Cubicle 7. But I do know that commitment is there, and I think we can all take encouragement from that.
Well, if you go to Stalia, Chrome says, a personal request, please make Stalia be more than bulls and paella and guitars.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
There's no promise about that. He says, I apologize to Mr. Davis if I look like the classic unbearable fan. We are all that kind of fan, Chrome.
For sure.
For sure.
That's true, and that's why we love you.
Well, far from the switch gets in the middle, so nothing coherence comes out. So from now we go back to the last of our question. I will say that the last two of our question. I must say that in Spanish now, so the audience get time to ask some other question, then we finish. So, back in Spanish, vamos por las últimas dos preguntas, así que si hay alguna pregunta más que quieran hacer desde el chat, es el momento, como también es el momento de darle like, de suscribirse si no están suscriptos y de compartir la entrevista.
Y después también pueden entrar a los enlaces que vamos a estar dando de RAM.
Exactamente, vamos a estar poniendo los enlaces ahora al terminar. Si podemos ya, creería que sí, al terminar el chat ponemos los enlaces al Twitter y al blog. ¿Sí?
Sí, así ustedes cliqui. No, sonidito.
Back to English. Yes. Well, I let Flor taking
This
that.
one is really long, so
Get comfy.
this one is not a question, but it's a request. We want you to share with all of us something you strongly recommend. May it be a book, comic you read, a movie you watched, an OST music group you love, etc. It has to be something you believe it's so important that it has to be shared to everyone, no matter if it's something that everyone knows, or somebody ever heard about.
Nobody. Or nobody ever heard about it.
It's long.
It's long.
Okay. Well, something that nobody ever heard about, probably in Spanish. I don't know if his work is even available in Spanish, but there's an American author whose name is Charles de Lint, and he writes modern urban fantasy, but his is different from any other modern urban fantasy. You know, it's not a romance novel with a werewolf, it's not adventure, but it is a world, an American town that is infused with magic. And you see people appear who are not what they seem and who can be magical in nature. And it's hard for me to describe without going into much more detail, and then we'll be here until tomorrow morning. But if you ever see any of his work translated into Spanish, Charles de Lint is his name. It's usually worth reading, and particularly his work set in a particular town, and I feel very bad that I cannot remember the name of it right now, but the lead character in this series is a woman whose name is Jilly Coppercorn. And any book featuring her is well worth reading. It's truly magical and intriguing. And I'm not usually a big fan of modern urban fantasy, but this somehow captures the atmosphere of folklore and fairy tales while still being very believable and immediate. I would recommend his work to anyone.
Well, taking note of that. So the last question from our questions.
Yes,
not so a question, this one too.
For the last, we want you to tell us, who do you think we should invite for a future interview?
Well, let me see. On a Warhammer theme, Rick Priestley is always very good company in an interview. Andy Law from Cubicle 7 is a very nice guy. He knows a frightening amount about the Warhammer world. He's always telling me things that I had either forgotten or never knew. He's also very pleasant to speak to. And yes, I think those two would be great people for you to interview if you would like to talk to them.
Yes, we surely love to do that. Well, we are going to go to the, I see two more questions. So, Poderoso Chrome say or ask, the archetypical characters of the manual will appear during the rest of the publications and will have some kind of evolution throughout the life of the line of the fourth edition.
I think I'm going to be mysterious on that point.
Okay, we are yes, we are mysterious. That's the.
However, to leave you with more than a simple refusal, I'll say something else intriguing, and that is that we talked about the horned rat and the skaven,
Yes.
And of course, there's also a popular game now called Vermintide, which features Skaven. And I'm not going to say any more than that, other than that they both involve Skaven. And I'm going to leave you to be intrigued.
Oh my God. We are going to eat each other in the intrigue. Yes. Well, Poderoso Chrome says, or answer, I guess it says, well, anyway, say, anyway, thank you very much for being here and having answered our questions. I wish you a happy holiday and that more will not claim you soon.
Thank you very much, and the same to all of you. And thank you, and thank you to everyone who enjoys Warhammer for your years of loyalty and devotion and enthusiasm, which has been as much of an inspiration to me as the inspiration I get from the world itself.
And for the last, when you say, the switch gets in the middle again. Sorry. For the last, when you were talking about the characters and Skaven, he writes, "Oh my Sigmar."
You'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I must ask a question that did not get asked, but we talk about that. I think
this is a tradition.
A tradition. I think people who normally answer that don't show up. Don't show up, perhaps for the language, maybe for the language issue. But do you like the potato omelette with onion or without?
Okay, now, before the interview, all you people listening at home, I was informed that this question is something of a cultural hand grenade. Being entirely ignorant of any cultural aspect to this question, I'll answer purely from my own palate, which is to say, I like onions with almost everything. And if I have inadvertently offended anyone, I apologize.
Very, very well.
No one can be offended by onions.
Yes.
Onions are great.
Yes. And there comes a question.
That's a good one.
How halflings make their potato omelets?
Each halfling makes potato omelets according to his or her own family recipe.
Perfect. Well, we must say goodbye in Spanish, but we will say goodbye in
a little bit.
In English too. The switch is coming out. I think we use it too much and it's kind of loose. So first of all, thank you very much for sharing your time and talking about Warhammer and about you, and let us know a little more about you.
Well, thank you for being such gracious hosts, and thank you for your interest.
And here Dan Alfaro says, you are a great person, Graeme. People who like onions always are. Well, in Spanish, gracias a todos los que estuvieron ahí. Si hay algún inconveniente con el idioma, les pedimos perdón, pero...
vamos a tratar de poner subtítulos si es que se puede.
Vamos a ver cómo hacerlo, a ver si podemos poner algún subtítulo y si no, lamentablemente lo único que queda es el traductor automático. Pero muchas gracias a todos los que estuvieron ahí. Vamos a saludarlos a todos. Mamert, David Wallar, Ramón, Rol en Familia, Ángel Álvarez... Serrano, lo había notado muy mal, perdón, mi letra es horrible, ya lo saben. Pablo Masuello, Pablo Davendanus, Pepor, Sondark, J. Trapero, Mariano Colmano, Dan Alfaro, Rubén de Juegos y Dados, Albertuso Man, El Poderoso Chrome, y Eneco Palencia, que son los que se pasaron por el chat, y a todos los que pasaron a lo largo de la entrevista. Gracias por estar ahí.
Sí.
Les mandamos un saludo. Muchas gracias también a Graeme. Thank you a lot, Graeme, again. I don't know, you want to say
Something.
Yes, some word on the interview.
Well, let me just say again, thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you to all the Warhammer fans for making it possible for me to keep writing and for providing me with such inspiration.
Thank you a lot for your contribution. And here it's another joke about a color called PT color. And it's a connection with unicorns, and someone is asking if you know it. I think
They probably not.
Yes, but an inner joke. Well, nos vemos. Hasta la próxima. Thank you. We end the emission here. We end the transmission, but we keep chatting a little bit. So, para todos los que nos están viendo, chao, 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 chao. Pincel y Minis, Eduardo, hello y buenas noches.
Goodbye.
Nos vemos. Chao, 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 chao. Adiós.